Good morning, Rocky Ridge students. We're almost done. 3 more chapters. Chapter 22 today. No business. At 9:20 on Thursday night, Greg sat next to his dad and his mom near the back of the meeting room in the municipal building. He sat up extra straight, once in a while, trying to see a small group of principals, because Mr. Z had said they would be there. In the second and third row down near the front, he was pretty sure he'd spotted the back of Mrs. Davenport's head. Greg squirmed on the folding chair, twisting his neck from side to side. He couldn't get comfortable. He had to sit. He had on a blue sports coat and a pair of itchy gray pants, a white shirt, his best black shoes, and a red necktie borrowed from his brother Ross. Dressing up was Mora's idea. Greg had complained, but she had insisted. What do you want to look like? A kid who just came in from the playground? Mora sat 3 chairs away. She was wearing dark blue pantsuit and a white shirt with a small ruffle at the neck. Her new business outfit, bought especially for this occasion. Then, Mr. Z and Miss Shaw on the other end of the row. Mr. Z sat next to Greg. Greg decided that his math teacher was just as twitchy as he was. Then, they had all been sitting, waiting, fidgeting, almost 2 hours. Greg had seen school committee meetings on the local cable TV channel, but he had always flipped right past. And now he knew why. These people talked and talked and talked. Health care for teachers, new science books, snow plowing, special education grants, state funding for tests, roof repairs, and on and on and on. Greg whispered to Mr. Z, "How much does the town pay the school committee?" Greg held up his right hand with the tip of his thumb and his forefinger and pressed it together. The first, Greg didn't get it. Then he whispered, "0?" Mr. Z nodded. So, there it was again. All the people in the world were caring, noble volunteers, except for Greg Keaton, who was selfish and greedy. The note card Greg held, the note cards Greg held had been rolled and unrolled, bent, chewed on, twisted until the black ink had turned gray and smudgy. But it didn't matter. Greg had planned out exactly what he was going to say. Anyway, and he got to talk first because he won the coin toss. Heads, a victory over Mora. But at the moment, he was wishing he had called tails. As Greg began going over the opening statement for the 9th time, the chairperson for the school committee said, "For the next item under new business, there is a proposal about a comic book club at Ashworth School." "Who is speaking about this?" Greg bounced to his feet and managed to say, I am." The chairperson pointed. "Please come up to the table and talk into the microphone." Mora thought Greg looked very nice tonight in his blazer and his gray slacks. His black eye almost gone, and she was pretty sure he had even tried to brush his hair. As Greg went down the center aisle, he got a good look at Mrs. Davenport sitting in the second row with the other principals. She wasn't smiling. Greg handed a copy of The Return of the Hunter and a copy of The Lost Unicorn to each of the 5 committee members. He also gave each of them a book club flyer. Greg sat at the table in the front of the microphone. A woman from the local cable channel turned on the TV on the video camera. A small red light began blinking at him, and Greg tried to smile into the camera, but his mouth was so dry, his lips got stuck to the front of his teeth. His pounding heart made him feel like he was a squirrel running around under his shirt. The microphone was high, so Greg pulled one leg under him, cleared his throat, leaned forward, and rattled off his first sentence in a loud, squeaky voice. "I am Greg Keaton, and I go to Ashworth Intermediate School." Greg gulped, forced himself to talk slower and lower. "I started making little comic books over the summer." He held up the Korean comic book. "This is the first one. And in September, I took some copies to school and sold them to my friends. One for a quarter. And everybody liked them, but I didn't know I had to have permission from the school committee to sell things at school until Miss Davenport told me. So that's why I'm here. That's why I'm here to ask for. Holding a copy of The Last Unicorn, Greg said, Maura Shaw lives across the street from me, and she made this comic book. I helped her, and now we both want to make more. I call them Chunky Comics, and we think kids will like them because they're fun to read. Kids could even collect them. Greg held up the book flyer club and noticed that his hands was shaking. Every month at our school, some of our teachers give kids an ad like this. Mostly the language arts or reading class. There are all kinds of books here, and on the back of this order form, the kids choose what they want and they bring their money to school. Then they buy the books. Kids really like them. So we want to do the same thing. Sell our comic book to kids at school. That was the cue for Maura to stand up. Greg turned stiffly and pointed at her. Maura Shaw will now explain the way our comic book club would work. Greg got up and headed toward the chair on the left side of the room, and Maura walked up to the front. If Maura was nervous, she didn't show it. From a file folder cradled under one arm, she took a slim stack of stapled pages and handed one packet to each committee member. She walked to the table, sat lightly on the front edge of the chair, separated some papers in front of her, spread some papers out in front of her, and said, "Good evening," into the microphone. She nodded and smiled at the camera and then to each committee member. Holding up her copy of the packet, she said, "Please look at the first page of the information I have handed you. This is a sample order from the Chunky Comics Club. Right now, there are only 2 titles available. The ones that Greg handed you, there would be a new order for every month, unless there weren't any new titles. Just like a regular book club. Teachers get to choose whether or not they want to be a part of the club. And just like a book club, when kids order comics, teachers get an order copy for free and have in their classroom." Maura looked up at the committee members and said, "Please turn to page 2. Greg was impressed at Maura's performance so far. No goof-ups, no shakiness, no drooling, just about perfect, except she looked like she was 23 years old. And was that makeup on her face? Or was it just the way her cheeks looked when she got excited about something? Because he'd noticed that before. Paper rustled up, and Maura said, "Our comic book club also wants something different. If we make money selling our comics at school, we will donate part of our money to the new book fund at our school library, 10% of all our profits." Maura moved on to the page 3. "We know there are other kids at the school who are good at writing and drawing, so we want to have some after-school workshops and maybe help other kids be creative too. And that might mean there would be some comics and maybe other kinds of books and stories for the Chunky Comic Club." Maura slowly turned the page, lifted up the packet, and made a dramatic pause. Gently waving the sheet back and forth, she said, "This last page is important. Regular book clubs are careful about picking the right kind of books to sell to different age kids. We're going to be careful too. Everyone knows some of the comic books at stores are really violent. Chunky Comics won't be like that. Everything sold by our club is going to be approved in advance by teachers. Mr. Xenopoulos said that he would be one of those teachers, and Mrs. Lindell said she would help too. And our new advisor, Mrs. Xenopoulos, would like to say a few words." Mr. Z stepped his way up to the front of the room. Maura moved over to sit by Greg. Mr. Z had no handouts. He sat down in front of the microphone and said, "I know it must seem like Greg and Maura are making a strange request. At first I thought so too. All of us, as you all know, I teach math, and I tend to think that way, mathematically. And the more I looked at what Greg and Maura were asking, everything adds up. It's completely logical. The book clubs have permission to sell books directly to kids at school. These clubs sell all kinds of books, including ones about cartoons and comic books characters. So Greg and Maura want permission to do the same. They have been creative and responsible, and they've found interesting ways to use the skills they have developed at school in reading, writing, art, history, science, and of course math. As teachers, we all try to prepare kids for life as they leave school for the time and they want to get out and earn money and become contributing members of the economic and society. So I think it's great that these kids are trying to do right now at their own level in a positive and practical way. And I don't see any conflict at all with the skills and values of our schools are trying to teach. Mr. Z took a deep breath and then said, I know some people don't think comic books are good for children. With your permission, I'd like to use a little math right here. I've been sitting in the back of the room and I've counted 41 grown-ups at this meeting. So I'm asking you to show of hands, please, how many of us used to read comic books once in a while when we were in elementary and middle school? Greg looked up over the audience and quickly counted 29 hands. Among the small cluster of principals, only 2 did not raise their hands. Mrs. Davenport was one of them. Mr. Z noticed a small pad of paper. Then he said, hands down, please. That was 71% of the grown-ups in this room. Now, how many of us read cartoon books when we were children or young teens? Cartoons like Peanuts, Garfield, or maybe Disney characters. All but 6 hands went up. Mr. Z made a note, a quick scribble, and then said, that's 85% of us. Then Mr. Z said, how many of us regularly looked at the comics or cartoons in newspapers or magazines when we were between the ages of 8 and 12? 100% of the hands in the room went up, even Mrs. Davenport. Mr. Z turned and smiled at the committee. There's my proof. Apparently, comic books and cartoons do not have power to keep children from growing up to become responsible citizens like us. The kind of people who run schools and school districts and decide how to spend millions of tax dollars every year. And I believe that these kids in our school will not be harmed by the Chunky Comic Book Club. If anything, I think they will be inspired and engaged in a lot of constructive ways. So I rest my case, and as Maura said, I am happy to be one of the teachers who make sure that every item presented by the club is appropriate. Mr. Z nodded to the committee members and said thank you. Then he stood up and walked back to his seat. A chairperson put a hand over her microphone and leaned to first left, then right to the. Let me start that over. Sorry. The chairperson put a hand over her microphone and leaned first left, and then right to whisper to the other committee members in the committee. Then said, thank you, Mr. Xenotopoulos, and thank you, Greg and Maura, for your interesting presentation. The committee would like to take some time to consider your request before voting. It's getting late, and if there is no other discussion, we can move to the last item under the new business contract. The contract was for the food service company for the high school. Greg watched the chairperson as she looked across the room. Greg saw her eyes stop and saw her face change. Saw that she was about to call someone because someone wanted more discussion about the Chunky Comic Book Club. Without even looking, Greg knew who it was. And he was right. It was Mrs. Davenport.